Patricia Gibson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady from Congleton. And I'm delighted to once again participate in a debate on freedom of religion or belief. Sadly, such debates to highlight the persecution of peoples based on which God they choose to believe in, which religion they choose to draw comfort from, is as necessary today as it ever was. The persecution of any religious group is a fundamental breach of the basic freedoms, our basic freedoms, and I wish to applaud the work of Open Doors, which works tirelessly to support persecuted Christians around the world, whilst drawing up its annual World Watch List, launching this in the House of Commons every year to great interest and support from MPs across the House. At this launch every year, MPs have the opportunity to hear harrowing first-hand testimony of those who have lived under these brutal regimes as Christians and bravely share the horror of the brutality suffered and the desperate things those persecuted have witnessed and which will be forever seared into their brains. In the global scale of persecuting Christian minorities, at number 1 in 2021 we have North Korea, closely followed by Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya and Pakistan. Countries where a person can be killed, forcibly converted as an alternative to death, subject to institutional discrimination, where blasphemy laws encourage the targeting of all religious minorities, where young Christian girls can be forcibly married off, and during the pandemic, life-saving aid being withheld from Christians unless they convert to Islam. And it is deeply disturbing and, quite frankly, inexplicable that less than 1% of refugees that the UK accepts from Syria are Christian, despite the fact that they are more than 10% of the Syrian population and are a persecuted minority. And I hope the Minister will address that when he gets to his feet. The list of despicable behaviour and practices carried out by or sanctioned by the state in such countries is completely unacceptable and must be wholeheartedly condemned. Earlier this year, I, alongside many of my colleagues across this House, was sickened to my stomach by the contents of the Open Doors report Destructive Lies, which exposed the appalling persecutions of Christians and Muslims in India. Now, the cover of that report bears the image of Preetha, not her real name, a pastor's wife in India. She was brutally beaten by Hindu extremists while praying with her husband and some friends. When she was taken to hospital, unconscious, she was refused treatment because of her Christian faith. The report lifts the lid on vigilantism against Christians, which has been sanctioned by the government machinery, with even the Prime Minister of India himself staying stubbornly silent on this issue, as Christians are dehumanised, discriminated against and subject to violence. There is no justice provided by the state through the courts or police, even despite public lynchings, with social media platforms apparently happy to host material that incites the targeting of religious minorities through mobs mobilising and discussing their plans on platforms publicly and visibly. The international community must use every ounce of its diplomatic and economic weight and strain every sinew to do all it can to counter this appalling situation. In addition, it must establish a fact-finding commission of violence and other human rights violations against religious minorities in India, since the situation there appears to be especially grave. Furthermore, corporations which own social media urgently need to increase its moderators who can address specific local issues of discrimination, harassment and violence circulating on their platforms and apps in India. We know this can be done, as in the US, Facebook has undertaken an overhaul of its algorithms and tripled the size of its moderation team to identify and address radicalised and inciting speech against black groups in the US. And the recent report, Hear Her Cries, sets out harrowing case studies of the persecution of Christians in countries such as Egypt, Syria, Iraq and Pakistan, with the kidnapping, forced conversion and sexual victimisation of Christian women and girls. Indeed, in Pakistan, research suggests Christians could comprise up to 70% of women and girls forcibly converted to marriage. And according to this year's Open Doors report, the total number of Christians killed for their faith rose by 60% to 4,761, of which 3,530 were in Nigeria. During the pandemic, there have been reports in Nigerian families from several villages receiving only 1/6 of the rations allocated to Muslim families, while in other countries where Christian persecution is rife, some Christian families had their ration cards torn up or were simply excluded from receiving COVID-19 relief altogether by the authorities unless they denied their faith. Those nations which attempt to dictate to people what God they should worship are regimes and nations which have no respect for basic fundamental human rights. The crushing of a minority faith is nothing more than a means of control, insidious control, over even which God you choose to worship. This barbaric persecution is evil, and I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady from Congleton, who was appointed a special envoy for freedom of religion or belief last December, bringing together UK efforts to promote religious tolerance abroad and works on how the UK can protect and promote this fundamental freedom internationally. I know this is an issue which matters very much to her, and I can say confidently that she will have the support of the SNP benches as she seeks to address the appalling religious persecution we have all seen too often around the world, and to help implement the Bishop of Trudeau's recommendations on Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office support for persecuted Christians around the world. Yeah.